Today is January 1st, 2024. I want to wish everybody a happy new year. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. This is going to be a focal point, a geopolitical focal point all throughout 2024. The US is engaged in proxy wars and interventions all around the globe. But this conflict in Ukraine, it's conflict, it's proxy war in the Middle East, and its ongoing military aggression in Asia Pacific. These are the three main fronts the US is working along, and what happens in Ukraine is going to affect the other two and all the other interventions adjacent to them. Let's start by looking at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is pro-Ukrainian, so please keep that in mind. While looking at it, you can see Ukrainian air defenses are active all across Ukraine. There are reports of Russian drone attacks taking place, and this follows a very large Russian missile attack. I'll get into that more in just a moment. We can look along the line of contact. The supposed bridgehead Ukraine was building on the Russian side of the Dnieper River. There's nothing about that at all. The Western media recently even admitted that was nothing more than a suicide mission for public relations points. You can see Russia continues pushing Ukrainian forces back to their starting points, where they had launched their fall 2023 offensive. And of course, a lot of the focus is around Avdeevka, outside of Donetsk city, and also Maryinka, where the Russian forces have now successfully taken that town. The picture grows increasingly bleak for Ukraine. Now, before I get into what's going on right now, I do want to talk about two relatively older news stories. First, the Ukrainian cruise missile attack on a Russian port in Crimea, and the severe damage or destruction of this landing ship. This comes to us from CNN from December 28. Satellite images show Russian Navy ship burning after Ukrainian strike in Crimea. And I want to show you the picture here. There's this one landing ship that had already been damaged, was being repaired, and it was hit again, and the damage looks extensive. Maybe it is partially sunk. I don't know. It really doesn't matter, because it was not even being used in the special military operation. And as you can see, this is a large port, and there are many active operational ships in the port, and Ukraine managed to hit the one ship that really isn't being used and is inconsequential to the conduct of the special military operation, or even day-to-day economic activities for Crimea or the rest of Russia. The CNN article says satellite images have revealed severe damage caused to the Russian tank landing ship following Ukrainian strikes on a port in Crimea. They're calling this a successful attack on the port. But again, this landing ship was not going to be used in the special military operation. This is primarily a land war. The Navy is not a major party to this. The parts of the Black Sea Fleet that are a party to it, launching cruise missiles, they can launch those cruise missiles from anywhere. They don't need to be at Sevastopol or anywhere within range of Ukrainian cruise missiles to do that. Something that we should take note of is that many of these Western articles about this attack are claiming French Scalp or British Storm Shadow cruise missiles. These are air-launched cruise missiles were used in this attack. It was not just one missile launched that hit this ship and did this damage. They will launch a multitude of cruise missiles, assuming most of them will be shot down. Most of them, or all of them, are routinely shot down in these type of strikes, which means you're hoping that at least one or two cruise missiles makes it through and does some sort of damage, in which in this case it did. But Ukraine has a finite supply of these cruise missiles. The UK and France are not able to send many more of these to Ukraine. And so you're using a long-range precision weapon to do what? To score public relations points, because that is the only purpose this attack had. And what it actually does, for people who are really paying attention, is illustrating how incapable Ukraine is of threatening Russian port operations in Crimea. I've talked about this often, about how Ukraine talks about isolating Crimea by blowing up the Crimean Bridge and cutting the land bridge, which they completely failed to do in 2023. But let's just say they did manage to cut the land bridge and destroy the Crimean Bridge. They're claiming that that would isolate the Crimean Peninsula from the rest of Russia. It would not. Crimea rejoined or joined the Russian Federation by referendum in 2014. The Crimean Bridge wasn't established until 2018. The land bridge was not established until 2022, which means Russia was supplying both the civilian and military presence on the peninsula by ship and by air for years. And they could continue doing this because they have a multitude of large ports that are able to handle civilian and military cargo. They also have airports that can handle millions of passengers and air freight every single year. Look at this attack. Look how infrequent attacks like this happen. In this particular attack, they hit one ship. The rest of the port remained in operation. And if you think about Crimea with no Crimean bridge, no land bridge, and Ukraine had to knock out these ports, would they be able to do it? We can see that clearly they cannot. They don't have the ability to knock out even one of these ports, let alone all of them, which you would have to do. You'd have to knock out all the ports and keep them knocked out indefinitely to cause any sort of impact on the civilian or military population on the peninsula. They're trying to project strength. What they're doing is demonstrating their ultimate weakness, their inability to actually threaten Crimea in any meaningful way. Again, this is done for public relation points, and I'll get into that a little more here in just a moment. Next, Maryinka, taken by Russian forces. This is, again, a relatively older development. Here from Tass, this is Russian state media. Zaluzhny concedes Ukrainian forces pulled out of Maryinka. There's one interesting part in this Tass report that was also picked up by a BBC article. It says Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu told Russian President Vladimir Putin that the Russian armed forces liberated Maryinka and the Donetsk People's Republic, which means they drove Ukrainian artillery further away from Donetsk and made it possible to improve the city's defenses against strikes. So right there, because we see what the Western media does when Ukraine loses cities and towns. They say, well, it was useless. It was a flattened suburb. Who cares? But in reality, they're improving the security of Donetsk, which quite a few people do care about, and which is strategically and politically important. It also says, though, according to Shoigu, over the past 9 years, Ukraine turned the town, located 5 kilometers from Donetsk, into a powerful fortification with underground passages. It was cracked open thanks to the decisive actions of our servicemen, he said. So this goes back to a point I made in a previous update about this new strategy Ukraine is adopting, where they're going to go on the defensive, they're going to dig in, they're going to do what the Russians did to defeat the Ukrainian summer-fall 2023 offensive. They're going to build these defenses just like the Russians did, and this is going to stop the Russians in their tracks. But I said that is unrealistic. Ukraine already has extremely well-fortified positions along the line of contact, and Russia has still demonstrated its ability to breach them. What people continuously forget is that Ukrainian forces never actually made it to the bulk of Russian defenses, their fortifications that they had built ahead of the offensive. They never reached it. Russian forces defeated the Ukrainian offensive by using overwhelming firepower. I've talked about that at length many times, and this taking of Maryinka proves that Russian manpower and advantages in firepower are just as good on the offense as they are on the defense. They did not do this lightning fast maneuver warfare that Ukraine was attempting to do last year. They simply chipped away at Ukrainian defenses until eventually they were all pushed back. Everything collapsed and they all pushed back. And that is what they're going to continue to do all along the line of contact until there is a general collapse in Ukrainian fighting capacity, either locally or across the entire line of contact. That's when we may possibly see large-scale, faster-paced maneuver warfare from the Russians. So Russia takes Maryinka. Ukraine carried out this attack on this port in Crimea. They sank one ship that was not even being used in the special military operation. Otherwise, the port continued as usual, and all of Crimea's other ports remained in operation. But how does the Western media depict these recent developments? They depict them like this Al Jazeera article. This is hardly unique. You'll see articles like this across all of the West and pro-West media. Ukraine drives Russia back at sea and in the air, but concedes land. So they're driving Russia back at sea by partially sinking a landing ship that was not even being used in the special military operation, and in the air. And this is them repeating these claims by Ukraine that they shot down 5 Russian warplanes in a week, which is, there is absolutely no evidence at all. But then they admit that Ukraine has actually conceded land. And it says Russia lost a landing ship and 5 planes this week, but took a flattened suburb, as if Russia has come out behind after this week of fighting. And this is what the Western media has been doing all along. They spin everything that is happening. They attempt to make it as if Ukraine is on the march, Russia is falling apart, in shambles, their soldiers are poorly equipped, underarmed, they're running out of everything, and Ukrainian victory is inevitable. And people who were reading these type of articles over the last 2 years, they genuinely believe that, which is why so many people were shocked and beside themselves when the Ukrainian offensive in the summer and fall of 2023 completely failed. It was decisively defeated by Russian defenses. Anyone who objectively analyzed the entire conflict and the lead up to the offensive would have known that the offensive was guaranteed to fail. It had no possibility of succeeding, and it did not succeed. And yet the Western media was able to convince so many people otherwise, precisely because of articles like this in Al Jazeera, and you will see similar articles in the BBC, Reuters, and everywhere else. And we have to go back to articles like this, where the Western media actually admits what is really going on. The ghost of Kiev was never alive, Ukrainian Air Force says. And in this article, the Washington Post says something very interesting. It says, Ukraine and Russia have been spreading propaganda during the war, with Ukraine focusing on hearts and minds internally and throughout the West. Government officials in the invaded country shared day-to-day events, operations, and victories on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. Social media platforms have been struggling to keep up with fast-spreading, dubious information, engaging in fact-checking that sometimes goes beyond their own policies or contradicts them, the Washington Post has reported. And of course, we know now that Ukraine has lied about almost everything, virtually everything, which again explains why so many people were shocked that the offensive failed, because they were taking Ukrainian claims at face value. And you still see the Western media taking Ukrainian claims about Russian losses, the missiles and drones that they're intercepting, planes that they're shooting down. You still see the Western media taking those numbers and presenting them at face value with no warning that Ukraine has consistently lied about all of this, and that if anything they were saying were actually true, the battlefield would look completely different at this point. So that is Ukraine's standard operating procedure, to never admit defeat, to always portray everything as moving toward victory, even when it so clearly is not. So speaking of propaganda, we saw Russia carry out these missile strikes all across Ukraine, over 100 missiles. We really don't know exactly how many. I heard claims everywhere from 110 to over 150 missiles. I don't think we'll ever know, but Ukraine is claiming it's the largest missile barrage so far. And I and many others were pointing out that Russia had stopped conducting large-scale missile strikes for several months. They were clearly stockpiling these missiles, and now this is the first of what I think many people expect to be a large number of barrages that will be conducted more regularly now. They struck targets all across Ukraine, arms depots, airfields, air defenses, and military-industrial production, whatever is left of it. And we saw footage of Russian cruise missiles firing flares like a warplane, like a manned warplane, and they were doing this before hitting their targets, and this is to confuse and evade air defenses as they home in on their target. Now, I have heard bizarre claims coming out of Ukraine that they now admit they cannot hit supersonic and hypersonic Russian missiles, that they have not been able to do this, not even one single time. That is an extraordinary admission, considering how, for now almost 2 years, they have claimed they've shot virtually everything down that Russia has launched at them, which, again, nobody should have seriously believed those claims. There was no evidence to suggest that that was true, and yet the Western media on a regular basis repeated these claims made by the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian military. In the wake of this missile attack, Ukraine carried out a retaliatory strike on Belgorod, right along the Ukrainian-Russian border. They claim they hit, well, let's look at this BBC article here. Ukraine war, Kremlin says 20 dead after attack on Russian city. And you can see they're just shelling and firing rockets and drones at downtown, which is what Ukraine always does. That's what they do at Donetsk City. That's what they've previously done in Belgorod. That's what they've done to Moscow itself. They're terrorizing the civilian population. I'll get into that in just a moment. This is what the BBC says. Moscow has accused Ukraine of deadly airstrikes on southwest Russia, with 20 people killed and more than 100 injured in Belgorod near the border. The regional governor said 3 children were among the dead in what was one of the deadliest attacks on Russia since it invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian security source insisted that only military infrastructure had been targeted in Saturday's action. The BBC could have very easily just went to pro-Ukrainian accounts on Telegram and on X and seen pictures of dead Russian civilians, women and children, on pro-Ukrainian channels, and with pro-Ukrainian commentators cheering on the death of these civilians. They could have very easily have done that and reported on it, but it would not be politically expedient. The attacks follow Russian strikes on Ukraine on Friday, which killed 39, again, according to who, and did they confirm that? Those strikes were described by Kiev as Russia's biggest missile bombardments of the war so far. So again, the BBC repeating claims made by Kiev, taking it at face value, not questioning it at all. That is what they have done all throughout this conflict. But we know for sure that these attacks are done for purely propaganda value. Do you remember articles like this from the Business Insider? This was August 2023. Drone attack on key Russian bomber highlights Ukraine's psychological reach deep within Russia's own borders. This actually is an article about one of the rare instances when Ukraine actually did hit military targets in Russia. And they cite former U.S. General Ben Hodges. This is what he says. There is a psychological aspect to this, Hodges told Insider. The Russians need to know all the BS they're hearing from the Kremlin is BS. And the Ukrainians need to know their government is striking back at Russia. The bomber's destruction, which is yet another reminder Russia is struggling to protect its equipment, especially within its own borders, will simultaneously serve as a morale hit for Russia and a boost for Ukraine, Hodges said. And this is exactly like the attack on the landing ship. They hit some bombers, they damaged some, maybe they destroyed a few of them. The fact is, Russia has more bombers. They're capable of building more bombers every single year. They will replace those bombers. And even if for some reason they couldn't, they have many other ways of delivering these air-launched cruise missiles that they use these bombers to launch. This is not going to impact the conflict strategically. It is done purely for public relations purposes, to score points, propaganda victories. And you do that when you are actually losing the war. You want to try to convince people that you're not losing the war. So you do things like this. Because if you weren't losing, you would just continue to do what you were doing, leading towards your victory. Only Ukraine cannot do that. Remember, there were articles like this from The Guardian. Kiev's drone strikes on Moscow mean Kremlin's war can't be ignored by Russians. Attacks keep up pressure on Vladimir Putin, although have become not a big deal for many unmoved Russians. So they're again admitting that Ukraine carries these attacks out purely for propaganda purposes. It's not even really they're admitting it's not even impacting the Russian public. It's more to boost the morale of the Ukrainian public, because again, they're losing the war. And this Guardian article says a new campaign of drone strikes, again, this is August 2023, by the way. A new campaign of drone strikes has targeted the Russian capital in recent days as Kiev has demonstrated its ability to hit Moscow and keep the Kremlin's war in the hearts and minds of the Russian elite and others seeking to ignore the invasion of Ukraine. And it also says the raids into the bordering Belgorod region by both dissident Russian units and Ukrainian saboteurs with a loose link to the official military. That is nonsense. It was directly organized and conducted by the Ukrainian military. We're said to have the same purpose, with Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky increasingly talking up the reach of his country's forces. Again, this is them admitting these attacks have no strategic value. They're not impacting the conflict in any sort of strategic or even tactical way. It is purely for optics. It is to try to convince at least some people that Ukraine is not losing the war when in fact they are decisively losing this war. This is a desperate attempt to cover up failure, Ukraine's failure, NATO's failure, the collective West's failure. And this is not unlike Nazi Germany's use of the V-2 rocket. This is a rocket that they developed at the end of World War II. And they were shooting them into London. They were blowing up buildings, killing people. It was causing a lot of damage, but it had absolutely no strategic impact on the outcome of the war. Germany was irreversibly losing the conflict. They had absolutely no way of winning. They were launching these rockets for propaganda value to try to terrorize the British public, which I don't think it did. I think it had the exact opposite. It just made the British public more determined than ever to see the war through to its end, and then make them less sympathetic toward the Germans when the war finally did end. And I think the exact same thing is going to happen to Ukraine. They are inevitably going to lose this conflict. There's nothing they can do to change the outcome of this war. And all they're doing by attacking Belgorod, killing women and children on New Year's Eve, is hardening the Russian public against Ukraine, unifying them behind their government and military, and ensuring Ukraine loses this war in the worst way possible. Very disturbing how history repeats itself despite all of the warnings being there in hindsight. But Ukraine and its Western sponsors are determined to continue pushing this conflict forward. We have to remember the reason the US is continuing to push this conflict forward is to inflict as high a cost on Russia as possible. They know Russia will win. They want the cost to be as high as possible. The US knows they will lose the Middle East, but they're encouraging Israel to kill and destroy as much as possible, to raise the price of moving on without the US as high as possible. And the United States knows China will prevail. It will reunify Taiwan fully with the rest of China, but they want to raise the cost of that as high as possible. And so we have these three fronts where the US knows more or less that they're going to lose. There really is nothing they can do to reverse their failing fortunes, but they want to raise the price as high as possible, which means death and destruction for everyone living in these three regions of the world. We have to be aware of this. We have to continue to speak out against this and do whatever we can to put a stop to this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest people follow me on Telegram. And if you're looking for daily updates about all of these conflicts, you can find that on Telegram. I also highly recommend the Duran, both Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikuris's own individual channels. They do daily updates in detail on especially Ukraine, but also many other issues related to geopolitics. In the video description of this video, you will find all the articles that I link to, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. They're not doing me any good at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others to help get the word out, I greatly appreciate all of that. That is what allows me to continue doing this work. Thank you so much for that. And as always, thank you for watching.